Our story today is Mr. Messy. This is a book by Roger Hargreaves, and it's a great story. Ready? Here we go. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you have ever met in your whole life. He lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling. The windows were broken. The garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in the messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up. He brushed his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste. He had breakfast and spilled cornflakes all over the floor. He set out for a walk. He tripped over a broom that he had lying in his garden 2 weeks before. Mr. Messy walked through the woods behind his house. He walked right through the woods until he came to the other side. And you know what he found? Mr. Messy found the neatest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning, I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said the other man. "Tidy and neat," said Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "And we're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy. "The people who own the house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Tidy, looking at Mr. Messy. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and off they went to Mr. Messy's house on the other side of the woods. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I've ever seen in all my born days." They both said at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. Before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed, mowed, pruned, snipped, clipped, and dug, and made the garden look neat, neater than it ever had looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned, trimmed, rubbed, painted, mended, and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy. And they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed, they swept, they polished, they scrubbed. They made the inside of the house look neater than it had ever looked before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. "All finished," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy didn't know what to say. They both looked at Mr. Messy. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. "Precisely," said Mr. Tidy. "What we're both thinking," they said together, "is that you look too much messy to live in this house, Neat. But Mr. Messy said, well, whatever Mr. Messy wanted, there was no use. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms. Mr. Tidy got hold of the other, and they picked him up and put him right in the bathtub. Mr. Messy wasn't used to taking baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed, brushed, cleaned, scrubbed, combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. "You know what I'm going to have to do now?" he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. "Well, what are you going to have to do?" they said. "I'm going to have to change my name," he said. And they all laughed together and became best of friends. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from two people. And you know, what those two people are called, don't you? That's our story, Mr. Messy. I hope you enjoyed it.